Hey everybody, I'm Eric Johnson. I'm the CTO for GetLab Inc. It's April 22nd, 2021, and I'm doing an AMA on YouTube. So we've got a document. I see, Todd, you've got the first question. You want to voice that over?
Sure. Morning, Eric. I was just curious, what are the strongest headwinds that you're seeing for GitLab for this year is, from an engineering perspective? And then on the other side, what are the opportunities that you see?
Yeah, yeah, good question. I think in terms of headwinds, I mean, we're spending a fair amount of time right now just trying to figure out how to remodel the org as efficiently as possible when needed. So those of us that have been here a while, we grew really explosively in 2018 and 2019, like 100%, then 130%. And now we're growing. We grew a lot less last year due to the pandemic and widespread sort of conservatism um, kicking in. Now we're growing somewhat more than that, but still it feels like compared to those heady days, um, it was easier to add headcount where we felt we were weak or soft and make up for it. But of course, it's not. There's no free lunch. Like when things are so unconstrained, you of course can. There's the chance that you get sort of like flabby, so to speak, in different areas. I think we did a pretty good job. I'm not terribly worried. We were all thinking, at the time, like, hey, this is a unique opportunity that's not wasted. So I'm proud of how we grew in that period of time. But now it's like, in many cases, we have to wait for attrition before we're talking about adding new vacancies to specific teams that need them or whatnot. Um, it makes it that much harder to respond to changing business conditions, almost like physics. So there's been an increase in abuse. So we've had to work very hard to figure out how we're adding to our abuse team. We did spend a couple hours yesterday prioritizing some new funding that finance gave to us. So that was fun, a fun exercise. There was a lot on that list. A lot has been building up on that list, but it's a good problem to have. So I think that's something that is a relatively new problem. Something, the price of Bitcoin goes through the roof. There's a six-fold increase in abuse, and we have to figure out how we're responding to that organizationally. Um, those are sort of new problems that we have. So that's something. I think 2021 will certainly be a lot easier than 2020 was in that regard, but still different than 3 and 4 years ago. And then the flip side, so opportunities. Let me share my screen. We can do a quick, for people that are wondering, like, how do we find out information about engineering? Sometimes I like to do this live. Just Google GitLab engineering, go to our handbook. At the top here, there's the FY fiscal year 22 directions. So that has a lot of information that can answer various people's questions faster than I can live. But if you go down to communication, here's our engineering management issue board. This is like a Trello board for myself and my 7 department heads, my direct reports. And top of my list is next quarter's OKR. So this is kind of like the most recent thinking we've been doing about opportunities we're pursuing and whatnot. So we've got GitLab Private up here. That's a new delivery method. We're going to put a lot of work and effort towards licensing and renewals. That's where some of the abuse is happening, but also lots of opportunities to improve things for customers and sales and people we've got in the account management and support front. We have this metric called MRARR. So MR is tied to revenue. This is relatively new. The quality department's been driving it up. It was undefined as of 3 months ago, and then they established a baseline of, I think, 2. I think they drove that to 18, and then this quarter we're going to try to drive it from 18 to 30. So this is about open source engagement, particularly with our big paying enterprise customers, which is exciting. But just one of many of the open source initiatives we're doing. This is a big one. Like we're doing a lot of work about how we scale GitLab.com to 10 million daily active users. So there's some sharding things going on. There's some usability things going on, particularly on merge request, which if you think of it as kind of the main unit of work for a developer that's spending all day in GitLab. We've got this new thing called engineering allocations. So engineering is going to get to prioritize within certain teams and within certain subject matters like security related items, scalability related items. And this is a new sort of power we've been granted by SID and by product management. And I'm determined that we're going to make the best of this. And so Christopher and I are going to spend a lot of time kicking this off, making sure that we're spending that budget, so to speak, as wisely as possible. And then we've got a bunch of team things. I say here deliberately taking on 2 rather than 3. You know, we have this kind of thing of 3 OKRs max, 3 KRs max. So it kind of implies every leader has 9. In this case, I really want to make sure we've got focus on some of these things up here. So I'm deliberately taking on 2 rather than 3. But there's some big important stuff in here. So 100% of our org completing our diversity training. And then we've got some critical department hires. It's been a while since we hired really fast. So it feels like we need to deliberately shift back into that gear where we're, yes, making rapid hires, but more importantly, making quality hiring decisions. So we're going to focus on that. So those are kind of that's my latest thinking in terms of what we can do, especially over the next 3 months. To align with the stuff we're doing for the year. And then, you know, if you Google it, there's a 3-year strategy in the handbook. And I think that's going to be updated soon. We just did an e-group offsite. And Sid brought up, hey, you know, we've actually accomplished a fair amount of this stuff sooner than we expected. I think when it was originally said, it was before my time, but it was like a 10-year thing. We're about 6 years into that, and we've actually checked a bunch of those boxes. So I think the e-group is going to reboot it. So I think you'll see some ambitious targets in there around revenue achievement, but also knowing that we're an open core company. There's a lot of people that are engaged with GitLab, work here. Maybe they're on our core team. Revenue is less meaningful to them. We're also talking about how can we take on a goal related to being open source. So whether it's a certain number of contributions per month, or I was thinking, hey, people would be the natural sort of complement to revenue. So instead of contributions, let's think about contributors. Let's have a goal for a certain number of contributors per month. And it'll be ambitious. So it'll be like, hey, whatever we've got today, let's 10x it over 3 years or something like that. And then engineering will spend probably, obviously we contribute to revenue, but in terms of making it really tangible, I think that's the goal where we can do things and see the result, you know, the next day. So it'd be a tight feedback loop for that sort of stuff. Whereas revenue is kind of like we build a feature, still sells it 3 months from there. The revenue hits 6 months later. It's a little bit more distant, I think, to people in engineering, but the contributor thing will be hopefully more immediate and a tighter feedback loop. Any questions on any of that spiel? All right, why don't we move on to Alejandro? Alejandro, you want to voice over number 3?
Yep, sorry. Just wondering, so what are the responsibilities of a CTO? I know that for me, I look at CTOs and then CIOs, and I wonder if those have changed, and if those are different in a company like GitLab.
Yeah, so great question. If you Google around like CTO roles, Chief Technology Officer roles, you'll find a bunch of blog articles that kind of describe that this is probably the one of the least, or one of the most broad, one of the least poorly defined C-level positions. So it can mean a lot of different things. You know, being on the TAM team, you're probably working a lot with large enterprises. So CTO starts to take on a specific role. And you mentioned the potential collision between what's the CIO, what's the CTO. That makes sense at those large organizations. But over the lifespan of a startup, like our founding CTO is DZ, who is the founder of the open source project. And that's a very specific role and an unreplaceable one. And he still fills a lot of that in terms of shepherding the open source project. And then there's, you know, 2 companies ago, I was at a company that was at 2 different markets. So we sold to large media companies and also to advertising companies. So that company had 2 CTOs, but they were both really like the lead sales engineer. That was the role. So that role was entirely outward facing. And then there's the type of CTO I am, which is, you know, I came up kind of through the development ranks. Then at one point, my title was VP of engineering. And so that's the thrust of my responsibilities. Like some CTOs, unlike the CIO types you referenced, they may just run like a small lab of people and they're doing like pure R&D and they're actually separate from whatever engineering and development exists. But in this case, I have, you know, half the company, 550 people reporting to me, so I'm a managerial CTO. But we did recently start this new department called incubation, the intent of which is to maintain our strength at incubating new areas, expanding the breadth of GitLab and what GitLab Inc. does. Despite the, you know, typically when companies are as big as us, things start to slow down. There's this natural sort of creep of bureaucracy. Incubation engineering is an attempt to replicate that kind of small scale environment where you can innovate very fast. So we're going to be having what we call single engineer groups. So what we think of as like a whole stage of the DevSecOps lifecycle, but only one person, almost a founder-like person working on that. And so Bartek was recently promoted to VP of Incubation. We're recruiting now for those single engineer groups. I think they're all now up on the jobs page. And if we've got internal or external candidates that want to do something like that, that's kind of our version of labs or office of the CTO. So I think my role is kind of a blend of the three that I mentioned. I certainly try to help out sales whenever possible. I'm the executive account sponsor for a number of our big customers. I try to be point and shoot from McBee's perspective, wherever he thinks I can be most useful in accounts. I'll go and help out those that relationship in those sales teams. And then I'm running engineering, and then we're doing this sort of labs thing. So it's kind of, I'm trying to cover all of those bases as well as I can. But it'll change again in the future. That's the nature of startups and high growth companies, is new responsibilities come up, or things we're doing don't add value anymore. And I try to be a very scalable person and be constantly remodeling myself to the needs of the company.
Thank you.
Sure. Brad, number 4.
Sure. Thank you, Eric. Could you speak to, and I apologize if you've answered similar questions before, could you speak to the value of a college degree or lack thereof at GitLab specifically, and then in the tech industry as a whole, particularly for young career people?
Sure. Yeah. In my personal circumstances, I do have a 4-year degree, but it's in philosophy, not computer science. So that's my situation. So I started college double E, electrical engineering. I got kind of burned out. I went to my first day of classes sophomore year, and I wanted to do robotics and things like that in retrospect, but the program I landed in ended up being all abstract math. It was mostly chalkboard work, and that just wasn't engaging me as I had hoped. So I walked to my advisor's office, and I had kind of 2 interests at the time. One was philosophy, which is surprisingly similar to engineering. It's systems thinking at the end of the day. And I think in retrospect, my needle went from, being burned out on electrical engineering and went to the other extreme. And I ended up choosing philosophy. Computer science was always an interest of mine. I was learning how to program. I continued to program on the side all throughout college and after the fact. And then, I graduated and then was faced with what am I going to do with my life, and ended up kind of scrapping together a personal portfolio and getting my first job at a startup, writing web application code. And I tell people, like, it was invaluable, I think, but it's not a repeatable path. Like, that's not advice I would give. I feel very lucky to have made it where I am today, given those kind of initial conditions. But I think it also shows like where the technology industry as a whole is, where if you can do the job, you can still get the job. I think that's always been the promise of tech style startups, Silicon Valley style VC funded startups, is I think there's relatively low credential bias. There's some of it that exists, but for the most part, programmers especially can get by on their merits, which is I think a good thing. I think industry-wide, the change that I'm seeing that I'm excited about is you're starting to see more programs and universities spin up that are software engineering as opposed to computer science. And of course, there's still a strong computer science element. Like, being self-taught from a programming perspective, I needed to go back and learn some things that I missed out on in that computer science education, like big O notation and things like that. So I wasn't writing algorithms that worked but took longer than the age of the universe to execute, right? Like, that's not useful in a programming context. So you have to learn that stuff. If you're self-taught, you definitely have to go back in so you can work in a field where half the people have that formal education. But you don't necessarily need it. But like switching to software engineering is interesting, because there were lots of skills that people that I was rooming with or in the dorm with that were doing computer science, they weren't learning source control at the time. This is like late 90s, early 2000s. And they would get their first job in the technology industry at the time, and they'd have to learn all the techniques and things that software engineers were doing. That just seems like a big mess from academia's perspective. So I kind of hope the field shifts more towards software engineering, and then there still should be a significant amount of computer science being taught in those classes, in my opinion. And I think there's room for kind of like the same way you have physics, but then you also have pure maths. I think there's probably room for people that just want to focus on computer science, things like quantum computing, where they need to design new algorithms, even in advance of the computers existing. Like that should definitely exist, but it probably shouldn't be the track that everybody that ends up in the technology field sort of gets. I think that's a positive change. It's a more practical change in terms of training people in a 4-year degree for their work. But also, it'll be interesting to see over the next, let's say, 20 years, how much that requirement of a degree kicks in. I'm in the Bay Area, so the people I talk to, I still don't see a lot of energy for requiring the 4-year degree. So I think that's a good thing. I think the meritocracy holds. But every field kind of matures, and so it'll be interesting to see if that becomes a sort of an industry requirement. But as long as technology companies are high growth companies, and as long as that attracts venture capital, there'll be room, I think, for people to come in and found a company with some interdisciplinary background or some unique skill. And I hope that sort of always exists, to come in through the bottom, create a company in a brand new way that no one has ever thought of before, including the skills that are required. And that's, I think that would be a positive thing. In terms of GitLab, we don't require the 4-year degree, to kind of get back to your first question. And I would think of, managing your career in much in the way that I described is, we should be a meritocracy. We should be focused on people's capability, not their past achievements. Even maybe they have an advanced degree, maybe they worked at some deeply impressive list of companies. All it really matters is what they're going to do here. And there's many ways to provide value at GitLab, and to prove that you can do that value in the interview context. Interview process isn't perfect. I mean, at the end of the day, you have to spend, a handful of people spend several hours with someone trying to determine, hey, is this person going to be nice and effective for the next 4 years? Hopefully, it's a inherently imperfect process, but I think we need to remain open to, just the signal we want is, can this person be effective moving forward, regardless of what they've done in the past? And I don't see that changing at GitLab. I don't think there's any need. Any questions on that?
No, thank you.
Yeah, great question. Thanks for asking. Christopher Wang, what's your abstract question, number 5?
Yeah, so kind of an abstract question here, but we had SolarWinds a couple of months ago, and it just seems like we have these larger global scale cyber attacks in which hundreds of millions of people are getting affected, almost like on a biweekly basis now. So I was just curious as to your thoughts on global trends in terms of just cybercrime prevention, and whether or not a new paradigm is needed.
Yeah, good question. And I wish Jonathan was here, our VP of security, to speak to this, but I'll give it my shot. I think like the things that I've observed that seem eye-opening in recent history are like, one, like you mentioned, there's been this sharp increase in attacks. And like, I remember, I won't mention the name, but like a large sort of grocery retail chain, their credit cards, I think, were hacked. And it was like a surprising number at the time, like 30 million people or something like that. And I thought, oh, well, they're toast. Like no one's ever going to shop there again. And that didn't happen. And so it constantly surprises me when you have these like large consumer platforms, whether they're finance or whether it's a social media platform or something like that, there's a big hack and people don't seem to care. Like meaning like end users or consumers don't seem to care. And I'm wondering if that is that interesting, or does that just mean like the bad one hasn't happened yet? I'm still waiting for that one that actually affects people's lives. Because today it seems like these things that they happen, people don't tend to care, and then they're mitigated by like insurance. Like, people don't lose their homes, or they don't have to pay that credit card bill that was fraudulent or something like that. But I still feel like there's the potential for something like really serious to happen that changes that, whether it's like IoT devices getting hacked. I mean, there have been, I think, relatively constrained cases of nanny cams or security cameras or things like that getting hacked, or audio devices getting hacked. And so I think there's a potential for something to happen that actually makes people at large kind of like wake up to the issue. And I don't know what that is, but I feel like that's still ahead of us as opposed to behind us. And I'd say if the pandemic has taught us anything, is that as a species, we're not great at addressing things until after they happen. And so as much as I'd love to say, you know, we can prevent that sort of thing collectively, it's the realist in me says it probably has to happen, and then we're going to respond, probably overreact once it sort of happens. So that's one change. Kind of related to that, I think the Sony movie hack sort of situation woke everybody up to the idea that like there are state actors involved. It used to be kind of state versus state, maybe company versus company on an espionage level. And now it's clearly like, you know, everybody should be aware of state level attackers and the sophistication and the resources that they wield. So I think that's forced industry to really up their game. And that's been sort of unfolding for a while. Let's see, I had a third thing in my head. Oh yeah, I guess just when I started, you know, going back a couple of decades, it was like, you know, the security model was really, you know, put up a large wall around you, and like that's the defense. And then, you know, it's in practice, what happens is people can get through that wall and then have the keys to the kingdom, so to speak. And you've seen, I think, the rise of defense in depth, or what you think of like this sort of the onion model, is you really have to pay attention to the security at each individual layer. And you have to almost assume that you're going to be attacked, or that you already are attacked, but that you're going to be able to contain that attack, and someone's not going to be able to get the entire, you know, all the data or access to all the systems, buying time to, you know, detect that one thing and then sort of fend it off. And I think that's it's still eye-opening to executives that don't work in security, or you know, work in other realms or something like that. But yeah, this idea that, you know, you kind of assume that you're already vulnerable in terms of how you're reacting to it, is very pragmatic, and I think a lot more effective than just saying we're going to have the strongest VPN ever, or we're going to have the best IP tables that, you know, that anyone ever wrote. It just doesn't work in practice.
Thanks.
Number 6, Alan.
Yeah, Eric. So my question is, in our longer term roadmap, have we given some consideration to other groups within our customer accounts and tailoring the platform for their needs, like marketing, product management, using the core functionality, but putting more of a user interface on top of GitLab that's more directed towards their particular needs? I think that might be a way to extend, you know, our TAM, total available market, because we could add seats within enterprise accounts, enter into other groups, and then expand the value for the organization, the enterprise customer. I know there's SMB accounts that are basically using GitLab for their entire business. I mean, Nebula Works is one example. Small consultancy in San Diego tells me they do everything with GitLab. Marketing doesn't matter. I was wondering if you've given some thought to that concept of expanding our value proposition across other groups, not just development.
Yeah, definitely. We, just as a quick reminder, we probably shouldn't be mentioning individual customers on the, because we're public on YouTube, so we'll have to see if that's problematic or not. But answer your question is yes. So there is already features and energy and personas around not just like, let's say, the developer that you expect to be using source control. There's features for designers. There's features for ops personnel and security. But still, that's all within the engineering realm. So I think you're talking kind of beyond engineering into what we GitLab would consider other departments. We do that at GitLab. So like obviously we ask everybody to kind of run the company on in our GitLab-com namespace. But it's I think in practice it's taking a while to get there. So I leave it up to product management to determine like the priority of those sorts of things. I don't develop those personas or prioritize that. But yeah, we're looking for expansion. I think I mentioned above, coming up with a new 3-year strategic vision, something ambitious, something inspiring. I think to hit the types of numbers that are being talked about there, it's going to require doing what you said, which is increasing the TAM and heading into new directions. And I think we'll probably exhaust the typical classical engineering personas to do that. So I don't want to be prescriptive about which one of these that you listen here. But I think it's very likely. And I would guess of the 3 you mentioned, marketing, and product management, like product management is so adjacent to to engineering, the personas that are deep users of our stuff today. I think that's a very likely first bet. I mean, we have things like planning and portfolio management. I think we need to push on those things further. And then, think of who's kind of virtually sitting next to product managers is probably those product marketing folks. And they need a window into engineering. So I would tend to think of it as you kind of need to traverse that graph of like, here's all those engineering personas. There's the ones next to it. Who's next to that? You need to kind of like expand out into those, because as much as we've taken, I think, big risks building the whole DevSecOps lifecycle, if we're to do that for everybody that's adjacent to engineering, I think we spread ourselves way too thin. So I think we have to start to kind of establish these beachheads, and let's say it's product management, and then we're successful in that, and then we go to the next one. So be more progressive along that kind of expansion journey or adoption journey, depending on how you think of it.
Yeah, that's great. I agree. I get our near-term focus, and that's where we need to put all of our resources. And as we nail that, then go into these other areas to kind of tailor the user experience, because it's not always intuitive to these groups, and the feature functions of all the platform don't apply to their particular roles. And if we could tune it a little bit, when we get there, this is more the 3, 5, 10-year journey, but just thought I'd throw that out there.
Yeah, it's and I see we're at time. So the last thought I'll leave you with is like, Git is an interesting animal. I mean, a lot of people, when they first step source control or first step Git, it feels overly complicated, and then source control, saves you that first time as a coder where like you almost lost something, and you're like, oh, I get it now. And you read about these sort of underpinnings, like the data model that is inside Git, and you realize like, oh, it's complicated because there's irreducible complexity here. That's really important, even if you don't understand that initial value. But we probably have to find the right way to sort of hide that or abstract that away to get other personas on it. And there are, CMSs and other things for example, like marketing personas that are kind of like source control light. Like there are specific use cases that are about going back into history that I think are useful to a marketer, where they don't need the full power of Git, like line by line diffs. Like maybe they just need a window in time they're going back to. They don't need to know a specific hash of one line of code that was changed, like an engineer does. So if we can find the right way to abstract that away without all the sort of like technical underpinnings to just the specific sort of historical value that a marketer or product marketer professional needs, there's probably a way to do it and have Git underneath and just somewhat sort of hidden, so they can focus on the marketing power of that campaign, or the visuals of the assets and things like that, and less about this sort of like mental model you have to have about a Git history tree. So that's an interesting problem for designers and product managers to think about. Great. Well, we're at time. Thanks so much for the great questions.